Okay, so yesterday we left off talking about Plessy versus Ferguson, which is the case that essentially makes segregation possible in the U.S. It upholds segregation as being legal. It says separate but equal is legal. So it's a pretty shameful case in American history. It's one that's been overturned since. We're going to start today by looking at another case that is also, in my opinion, I think, well, also in the opinion of the U.S. government, who's formally apologized for it, another pretty shameful case in our history. So to kind of set the stage for this one, you need to know a little bit about World War II. Not much. Essentially, all you need to know is, the U.S. is fighting this war against Germany and Japan. Um, there are a lot of Japanese Americans living in the United States at this time. Um, Most of them lived on the West Coast, and even before the war, they faced quite a bit of racism. But leading into the war, and especially once the attacks on Pearl Harbor happened, when Japan, bombs Pearl Harbor, um, these Japanese Americans start facing a pretty big surge in racism, and there's a pretty big surge in fear of what the Japanese could do. And obviously, this leads to some poor treatment for these Japanese Americans living in mostly the Western United States. Um, it's also a problem because U.S. Military officials and government officials um, start to worry that for some reason these Japanese Americans might be disloyal to the U.S. and that they might support Japan, and maybe there are spies among them. Maybe they're going to do things uh, to hurt America. And really, there's no real evidence for this. The evidence that the court actually uses ends up being pretty much doctored and fake. Um, and there's never going to be any proof of disloyalty among any of these people. But nevertheless, as you can see on the screen, 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans um, are uh, forced to live in internment camps, and another word for that is concentration camps. I don't want you to think that the same thing is happening that the Nazis were doing to Jewish people in Germany, but I mean, with the dictionary definition of the term, you're taking a bunch of people, you're concentrating them in one area, and not allowing them to leave. Like that's a concentration camp. So this is something the U.S. government did. You can see here are pictures of what the camps looked like. Here is a camp that was in Arkansas. Um, that was lived in by Japanese American people, and they were not allowed to leave, couldn't go anywhere else. They couldn't take their property with them except for just a bag of stuff that you could fit with you. So a lot of these people are forced to sell their farms, they're forced to sell their businesses. Um, there's some cool stories too of these people's neighbors helping them. Like there's a story of a guy who essentially runs his neighbor's farm for them while they're gone. But by and large, I mean, you're talking about people who are forced to give up their entire lives, forced to sell things for less than their worth, but essentially because the U.S. government gives in to fear. And in this Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus U.S., Fred Korematsu, who's a Japanese American man, is essentially suing the U.S. government, saying, what you're doing to me is is it's against my civil rights. You can't just force me to move somewhere and live somewhere and take my stuff away from me. Unfortunately, in this instance, the Supreme Court is going to side with the U.S. government. They essentially say that your civil rights don't compare to the national security of the United States. So it's a pretty unfortunate one at the time. It upholds the U.S. essentially ignoring people's civil rights in the name of safety, even though there's no proof that anyone's safety was threatened. Um, and you can see here where all these camps were. It wasn't just one or two, mostly along the West Coast and the western part of our country, but also some closer east in Arkansas, which is the picture you see here. You can also see pictures of people being put on buses to go to these concentration camps. This is a case that hopefully someone will do a project on and teach us a little more bit about along the way. I wanted to do that case before I did Brown versus Board of Education because in some ways they're kind of connected. And Brown versus Board of Education is maybe it's one of the most important Supreme Court cases in the modern era, maybe the most important one, because it paves the way to ending segregation. This case is, responsible for overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember, the line from Plessy versus Ferguson is separate but equal is legal. This case is going to undo that. So this case starts with the Brown family who live in Topeka, Kansas. They don't think that their daughter is getting a fair education because she's forced to go to an all-black school, and they sue. They sue the Topeka Board of Education. Um, uh, it goes to the Supreme Court, and it's in the Supreme Court for years. So the Supreme Court has a tough time deciding what to do with this case. And in the midst of the case, the Chief Justice dies and is replaced with a guy named Earl Warren. And he's an important character just in U.S. history, but he's especially important for this case. And the interesting thing about Earl Warren is that he's the former governor of California. He used to be in a lot of different positions with the U.S. government. And he was an advocate in the 40s for putting Japanese Americans in internment camps. He was afraid of the possibility that they might be working with the Japanese, and he pushed for having these people put into internment camps. After the war is over, Earl Warren, and he wrote this, it feels horrible about what he's done. He realizes that, he, because he was afraid, was comfortable taking away protections for people. And he kind of, it's a cool story because he kind of flips the card. Like, he goes from being someone that was taking away people's civil liberties to someone that ends up being in a large part the person one of the people responsible for giving people civil liberties. So he becomes the governor of California, and he desegregates the school system there, which was largely segregated between Mexican American students and white students. And then here in Brown versus Board, he plays a large role in convincing the other members of the Supreme Court to unanimously say, so that there could be no question, that separate but equal doctrine is unconstitutional. And their decision pretty much comes down to the 14th Amendment, which promises equal protection under the law, and says, these schools have to be desegregated because you're not giving people equal protection under the law right now. Black students are not receiving the same education as white students. Separate but equal cannot be legal because separate but equal is not possible. So this case is going to force schools across the country to desegregate. Specifically, we'll see a lot of these impacts in the South, but this case and the cases after it will impact the entire country. And you can see here a map of the country, and you can see which states forced segregation. So mostly states in the South, but some that are around the South, but not necessarily places that we would call the South. You can also see places where it was optional, like Kansas. Some of these places have no legislation about it, although it did exist. Like, even in places like California, segregation was a thing. It happened in school systems. And then some places where segregation is, forbidden, but it's still happening. It can't happen by law, but a lot of times it would happen just by the nature of how communities worked. And the next case we're going to look at shows a little bit more about how the segregation could happen. Before I'll show you this picture of the lawyers that worked on the case. Thurgood Marshall would eventually become a member of the Supreme Court himself. Now, the last one I'm going to talk about today is Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. And you'll notice the date here is 1969. Even though the Supreme Court decided in 1954 to end segregation in schools, it didn't do a very good job of setting a timeline. And in some cases, this meant that it took actual decades. Like, this is 15 years later, schools were still desegregating into the 70s. Then it would take decades for schools to try to integrate. And that meant different things in different places. In some places, especially in the Deep South, in places like Texas and Louisiana and Alabama, Mississippi, they just outright refused to be integrated. And there's some really cool stories about people like the Little Rock Nine, who were kids in Arkansas that were trying to integrate their school, where the Arkansas National Guard tried to prevent them from entering their school, and the federal government has to get involved. Some real stories of bravery of people trying to actually do things to change how America works. But in places like North Carolina, which are still southern states, but not in the Deep South, a lot of times they took a different tactic. This happened in Greensboro, really close to where a lot of us live, where they would say, we're going to comply with this ruling. And Greensboro was actually really quick to do that and say, like, we're going to comply with the ruling, we're going to integrate our schools, and then have a situation where they only let a few black kids be in white schools. They redraw districts to make schools more white or more black, and that way they could say, like, we're doing what they said to do, but still have schools that are mostly white and mostly black. So where the Swan versus Charlotte Board of Education comes in is essentially Swan is saying, sure, we've desegregated schools here in Charlotte, but we still have these schools that are almost all white and almost all black. So what they want Charlotte-Mecklenburg to do is redraw their bus districts. And they want for kids to be sent, maybe not to the school that's really close to their house, but maybe bused over. And that way, if we're busing kids over, you're having schools that are more integrated. You'll have kids that have, a closer number of black and white students together. And the idea behind this is that, even though schools had been desegregated, you're still seeing white kids getting more funding and better education at their schools, and black kids get worse funding at their schools. And the schools are still primarily black and white. This decision is set, and then what the Supreme Court decides is that Swan is right, that we should be busing kids. Not essentially what it's saying about Brown versus Board is not only should we desegregate schools, not only should we make it illegal for schools to be segregated, to not allow certain kids to come, but we should be trying to integrate the schools. So that's what this does. It tells Charlotte-Mecklenburg you should bus kids over to promote racial integration, and then it says that it only bans this practice when newly drawn districts significantly hurt a child's health or education. So that's where we'll pause today. We've got one more case that I want to look at here. And then we'll have a little project where you research some stuff on your own. Let me know if you have questions. Otherwise, have a good day.